Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of module 2, the design process. So we'll take a look at where we have been. Week 4, looking at U.S. Green Building Council, the beginning of the Green Morass 1, really kind of going through all these different components: sustainable sites, LEED, neighborhood development, some of the more, I guess, what we consider traditional. Then moving into week 5, looking at some of the more up-and-coming components: Living Building Challenge, SEED, Evaluator, Well Building, BREEAM, and the idea that all of these are starting to fall under the U.S. Green Building Certification Program, and acknowledgement that all of these different components need to be looked at as one. So this week, we're going to take a slight little variation on that and really look at the idea of the design process in the weeds, and the idea of how behavioral aspects of what we do can affect the strength of what we're doing with sustainable design and green infrastructure. I'm really looking at then art and innovation. And here we're going to be looking at this idea of creative placemaking, and we'll have basically the 5 tenets with creative placemaking and some case study examples of these folks. And then we're going to talk a little bit about social innovation and looking at this idea of behavioral economics, heuristics. What is it that causes people to embrace in a movement and really causes change? Because we can do all the great things that we can as designers, but if we haven't really thought about socially how the people we design for embrace this work, then we're all for naught. So we'll finish that up with week 6, and then we'll move into have a quiz on this next Tuesday. And then looking at the development of your adaptive strategies, your tenets, and your personal philosophy around this, which will end with our spring break. And so with that, let's get into it. So creative placemaking. It is, I think, a new response to why a lot of community engagement, community design isn't working. And so Markuson's study, which was a white paper done for cities, the League of Cities, National League of Cities, defined it as a place where partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, city, or region around arts and cultural activities. So really, this is about, as you're formulating your strategies around green infrastructure, to think about how it gets embraced in a larger move. So she goes on to talk about that successful creative placemaking is prompted by, and it's really there's sort of, she defines it as 5 tenets. 1, something where it's prompted by an initiator with innovative vision and drive. 2, it tailors a strategy to distinctive features of place. 3, mobilizes public will and attracts private sector buy-in, which becomes really important. It's a little bit like Well Building, and the way Well Building said, I'm looking at private sector, I'm looking at money, I'm looking at health, because the economic buy-in becomes really important if something's to be sustainable. 4, enjoys support of local arts and cultural leaders. And then 5, builds partnerships across sectors, missions, and levels of government. And, you know, here are challenges to creative placemaking, and I threw these in because in a lot of respects, they're not much different than the challenges that we see with green building, green infrastructure, and really looking at a sustainable way of how we create the built environment. Forging partnerships. These are non-siloed approaches. And that is what we have seen also, the successful aspects of the sort of green morass. And when we look at those rating systems, partnerships is everything. Countering community skepticism. This is like looking at greenwashing and the whole thing around that the green building is an elitist thing. There is a lot of skepticism around it. This also sees those same things. Assembling adequate financing, clearing regulatory hurdles. And just like with Living Building Challenge, if you come up with a building that has its own domestic water supply that's so fresh it doesn't need chlorine, and yet the standards say chlorinate this water, it's like, no, we don't have to. Same thing here. You know, what are those regulatory hurdles that are in place from bygone years that really affect these things? Maintenance and sustainability, we all know that one. Avoiding displacement and gentrification. And this really looks at, I think, that more social-minded approach to everything that we do, and certainly is important. And then developing matrix for performance, which we all know now is a key piece. So really, these challenges for creative placemaking are no different than the ones that we look at for green infrastructure and green building. So number one, that first tenet was, you know, creative placemaking prompted by an initiator with innovation, an innovative vision and drive. And so these are all five of these individuals are people that I have met and have heard their talks. And I picked them because, one, I knew something about them and I thought that was important. But two, I think they all bring a slightly different approach, which I want you guys to think about. All of them are all over the internet. All of them have done TED Talks out the wazoo. So you can find lots more about all of them if you would like. So Jake Barton has a company called Local Projects, Brooklyn boy. And his initial sort of entree into all this work was as an interior designer. But was interesting with his work, and this is one of his pieces, was really trying to figure out, how do I engage people and how do I take new technologies? So he clearly is looking at this idea of innovation through advances in technology to find new ways that people can interact. Crazy screen, you touch one thing, everything else blows away and you find out about it. So incredibly interactive. Yes, this is an interior installation, but he goes on to look at other ways that he can do these. Here's a couple other ones. This is a repeat from his Cleveland Museum of Art. Same sort of thing, the interactive way that these things blow apart. Here, you know, mimicking sculptures and looking at, so the whole technology piece that he's using, this media design, you know, really kind of led the way for him to think about it. But he was interested in, can I use these same thought processes and these same innovations to reinvent public space and really help people connect better with those spaces. He really looks at the idea of emotion and technology as a way to do that, and he's won a gazillion prizes. So here are a couple of his ones outside. So I can see what I'm doing. And here's a great quote from him. I design interior architecture for museums, but was always obsessed with the ways in which crowds of people, the audience really, could tell the story of the exhibitions better than the curators. Whether it's a World War II exhibit or an exhibition on cars, the expertise in the crowds was always so clear. I always wanted to find a way to harness those voices. When technology and internet really blew up, I realized that was it. I quit my job and I started Local Projects. I love this one, the big heart in Times Square. You know, and here you touch this thing and that's your heart. It's crazy, and it's crazy to watch people. So if we think about this idea of green technologies, It's that idea of not us as designers telling people why it's good to do it, but it's coming up with evocative and innovative ways that people want to share those stories. So the idea that people are so enthralled with this that it becomes their story is the way we start a movement. And so it's really, I think, these are wonderful projects to hopefully inspire you guys as you start to think about what your personal philosophy ought to be. StoryCorps is, without a doubt, one of the biggest, and the one that he is most famous for. Basically, it's a big box. You go inside the box, it's soundproof, and you tell a story. And then you can put your story in the Library of Commerce, and then it becomes basically a national oral histories archive, which is pretty neat. So it's kind of the celebration of people and their connectivity. And then people can listen to your stories because they're there. And you record them and people can listen to them. And his quote on this was, "The project is not really about the stories being told, however, it's about listening. It's about the questions someone gets to ask, questions they may not have had permission to ask otherwise." So it's extremely technology driven, but really inventive. And what's important about it is the element of people, and that without people in every one of these, doesn't work. This last one I think is great and really interesting in terms of that idea, Choreograph app, and how you can really sort of take technology and track people and their movements, and then the app starts to tell you scientifically what's happening, or what is the physics behind that movement. Why is that ball arcing the way it is? Why is it falling? How fast is it moving? What are you doing? So it's some of the newer stuff that he's doing. I'm interested in it because of my schoolyard projects. And again, this idea that technology somehow informs our day-to-day existence is pretty amazing. This goes back to the idea that if you have a smart house, and when I come into that house, I actually have a meter there that tells me how much energy is being used by my house to heat it. That if I have that kind of information, I have more knowledge and I do things differently. I might be more efficient with how I use energy in my house. I might be more active because when I'm active, I can see what that means and what are the physics around those activities. So how we engage people again is pretty interesting. Next one. So this is Stacy Levy. She is a public artist, sculptor in Philadelphia, and I have been intrigued with her work, and I think she definitely sort of falls within this tailor strategies to distinctive features of place. And in particular for us looking at green infrastructure, her work around stormwaters and water is pretty fascinating. So she makes visible some of the forces at work on site. Her interest is in watersheds, tides, growth, and erosion, and those ecological processes. But in order for her to accomplish that, she must bridge art with science. She must work with scientists, fluid dynamic engineers, and geologists to really understand it. This picture below is a recently constructed school in Philadelphia, and she basically has taken the downspouts from the roof and turned them into these very fluid, crazy patterns, which are the patterns of the drainage system for the Delaware River. And really sort of that connectivity between those things. And then, of course, the water's not going into the storm sewer, but it's actually going in to feed the rain garden and the plants that are on the site. Here are some of those more aesthetic expressions of place. So I think if you really want to get people to understand sustainability, an artful purpose to it becomes a really wonderful way to culturally and socially engage people. And I just thought these were just fun images to be able to show you guys. This one again, stormwater is her big thing, stormwater off roofs. And here, another twist on the gutter system, where the gutters are then coming down in and serve as the distribution for water into planter beds within the garden. Just kind of a wonderful twist on a much more, which can be a much more, you think a lot of urban agriculture, this playfulness is a way to really get people to understand more the systems and what's going on than the more traditional aspects of urban agriculture. So our next one here is mobilizes public to attract private sector buy-in. And Theaster Gates, out of all of these people, is my absolute favorite person. And there's a gazillion TED Talks from Theaster. And we're going to focus on two things. One, the Rebuild Foundation that really launched his career into this idea of placemaking and bringing back urban cores and urban areas. And then his next step with that is Place Lab, which is with Chicago University. So Theaster, I'm just going to read this. He is an artist by trade, very successful artist, and calls himself an American social practice installation artist. Born in Chicago, where he still lives and works, born in South Chicago, that nasty place that Trump keeps talking about that says it's so horrible. Theaster worked, and his work has been shown all over the world internationally, but he's really become famous now for his issues dealing with urban planning, religious space, and craft. And that's where it becomes really so important for us to look at. He is committed to the revitalization of poor neighborhoods through combining urban planning and art practices. So I think we take urban practices, his sort of urban planning practices, art practices, and then look at the idea of green infrastructure, and that even becomes more impactful. His first degree was in urban planning and then ceramics from Iowa State University. He got his master's there in fine arts, religious studies at the University of Cape Town. He is currently a professor at the University of Chicago, and just a cool dude. Moving along, his work. Here is just a couple of his studios with his overall practice. I think we've talked about this a little bit in terms of, and we'll get into a little bit more, the Dorchester projects and what those are about. He has won numerous awards for everything under the sun. But the Dorchester projects, or his work in South Chicago, is what. So for those who don't know Chicago, downtown Chicago, South Chicago, predominantly Black, blighted community. You can see here, this is a good map showing the number of vacant or abandoned buildings. This is definitely a great example of what we talked about in terms of the development of the city, of white flight, of redlining, of everything. It's a picture perfect example of all the things that we've done to inner city area that we have talked about previously in the history of the city. And so what Theaster did that was pretty amazing is, as he became financially solvent, sorry about that, damn, I hate it when I do that. When he became financially solvent as an artist, he moved into this desire, looking at urban spaces, looking at his communities to say, there's got to be more we can do. And that's when he said, okay, well, I'm going to do it because nobody else is doing it. The planners aren't doing it. The developers aren't doing it because it's not economically profitable. No one's doing it. And so he created Rebuild Foundation. And it really looks at this idea of rebuilding cultural foundations in underserved or underinvested neighborhoods and incite movements of community revitalization. And I love that term, to incite movements of community revitalization. And more importantly, that they are culture-based, artist-led, and neighborhood-driven. So he has very much tried to get a couple grants, but I'm not an artist, so I couldn't. But I do, working with some artists who have been funded through him. But the idea that the artist and the neighborhood, artist is leader, neighborhood is driving this thing, and it really speaks to the culture, is a way to start to create movement. And also, if done properly, as gentrification comes along, everybody's at the table together, and you don't get that inequity of that everyone sees coming in with gentrification. So that's another thing that makes this very powerful. His foundation consists of artists, architects, developers, educators, community activists, and residents. And they all work together to integrate the arts, apprenticeship, trade training, creative entrepreneurship into a community-driven process of neighborhood transformation. But it started with one thing. So this diagram just sort of articulates this a little bit more about this idea of this constellation to kind of move away from the architect-developer approach to the architect-developer, educator, community activist, and artist, which I think is really good. And that with that, then you get all of these things. You get economic redevelopment, you get placemaking, you get alternative entrepreneurship, you get cultural redevelopment. So imagine how wonderfully sustainable practices and green infrastructure and being off the grid and urban agriculture all fit into this really nicely. And one of the things that I sat in on a seminar with Yaster, and one of the things he said that our problems with cities and our inner cities is that there's an unequal balance of power. And by that he meant there is black talent and white power, and that somehow that has to level out. And I thought it was a very great way of describing that scenario. So here's the man. TED Talks, take a look at it. They're great. I've already mentioned everything on here, so we're not going to bother with it. But we're just going to go in a little bit to, you know, what he did. Because what he did was really kind of one structure at a time. He did not start with his foundation. He did not start with this